Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the fall presentation of the Religious Studies Student Organization. My name is Benjamin Gouch, and I'm the Vice President of RSSO. At my side is Laura Rodriguez, our President for this academic year. The Religious Studies Student Organization is a group of students, primarily religious studies majors, who sponsor events that relate to the academic study of religion. At this time, I'd like to ask that all members of RSSO stand up so we can thank you for your hard work in organizing this event. We would also like to acknowledge our co-sponsors for their help in putting this event together. First, Dr. Jones of the Japanese Language and Culture Program. Would you please stand, Dr. Jones? Also, we would like to thank the Film Studies Program and the Center for International Education. If you're interested in learning more about the Religious Studies major, minor, or the organization, you can visit our website by typing UWM Religious Studies into Google. The site has news about the program and the activities of RSSO.
Thank you, Ben. At this point, we would like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Mike Sugimoto, who has come all the way from California to speak to us today. Dr. Sugimoto earned his PhD in modern Japanese literature and aesthetic philosophy at Cornell University. He is currently a professor at Pepperdine University, where he teaches courses on the topics of modern Japanese literature, Japanese society and Asian film, and postmodernism in Japan. He is a member of the Japan Policy Research Institute, the Film and History League, and the Society for Cinema Studies. He has also published various articles related to Japanese literature and film. We are honored and fortunate to have Dr. Sugimoto here today to discuss anime and manga, two Japanese art forms that have become familiar and integral components of American pop culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mike Sugimoto.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for having me. I want to thank Professor Beal especially, and what looks like a very thriving, active community of religious studies people. Both people in the program now, and it looks like you have people who, lack of a better word, hang on, who keep in the community and keep supporting these kind of efforts. It's really fantastic at an academic level that you can have this kind of cooperation. So I applaud all these efforts. Thank you for having me. I'm not exactly a stranger to the upper Midwest. I lived for 3 years in Minneapolis, and it looks like I brought winter with me, which is great. Anyway, what I hope to do today is to talk somewhat broadly in an introductory level about Japanese religion and Japanese anime especially. And in order to do that, I'll be trying to bring up, I'm really not sure how much of a background you have, so I'm not going to assume any in terms of trying to place the two in particular anime that I'm going to look at, Ghost in the Shell, a little bit, and then also Nausicaa. So two very famous examples of Japanese anime, and I'll bring in as much culture, some of the aesthetic, visual arts background as is necessary to help make this maybe make some more sense, make some connections. But especially from a religious studies point of view, I hope to sort of cover areas that deal with the idea of text or word versus image, or sort of the language versus sort of pictorial representation, those kind of controversies in religion. And hopefully this will make sense as I get to some of my slides. Also a discussion of human identity, you know, what is man? And especially the genre that I'll be looking at, the sci-fi genre, does pursue that a fair amount. So I hope this will be interesting to you. Kind of a discussion of, is man a soul? Is he a spiritual being? Is he a material being? Those things too. And also the apocalyptic part. In other words, the futuristic aspect. And hopefully what you'll see is there is also a nostalgic aspect to these sort of cinematic depictions of the future, and I'll try to make some of those connections as well. I'm trying to see if there are any provisos I need to put in here. I have some film clips of Nausicaa. I've got an introductory film clip from Ghost in the Shell as well, so I'll leave that to your own discretion. I mean, depending, some of the anime and manga pictorials can be, I guess, what you would call somewhat racy. It just depends. So I'll just throw that out there right now, okay? Okay. Anyway, first, okay, is this working? Yes, okay. Reading. So Japan traditionally has been a highly literate society. So it's hard to talk about, I think, anime, which is the film representation of what is also manga. So what you're seeing here, a lot of these published books are manga, and for lack of a better word or phrase, we call them or translate them normally as comic books. Those of you that are familiar with manga know that comic books isn't exactly a very good description of them. They have an incredibly diverse range of genres, and they're heavily marketed to different groupings. So they can be more like what we think of as comic books in the United States, or they can be what we would consider more adult-themed. They can also target different age groups, men, the salarymen or white-collar worker, and even some towards housewives as well. But in other words, there is a long history of reading and literacy in Japanese society, pretty much unbroken, I think, since the 9th century. And that largely informs, I think, and is a huge foundation upon which you have something as popular as the manga sort of anime genre. And I mean, of course, everything is changing, but it used to be, and I think still is to a large extent, that you could find in Japanese, even somewhat remote villages, a fairly good or even humble or modest bookstore. And I lived in Europe for about 7 years altogether, in Switzerland in particular, in a very small village, and got around a little bit. And I was surprised that it's not that easy to find bookstores everywhere. But in comparing with at least my own experience in Japan, my own parents who didn't go past junior high, they read a lot. And it was pretty common to find places to buy books, basically. Now, depending on whether you call these books, okay, so this is kind of another question I'm going to throw out here too. And incidentally, e-readers have, I know they seem to have kind of gone through some kind of cycle in the United States, perhaps, but Japan has actually surprisingly shown a fair amount of resistance towards e-readers. And among highly sort of digitized technological societies, that's one area that there's been a kind of a preference for the traditional kind of hardbound kind of book. So I'll just throw that out there as well. And got some more. Okay, some more layouts of manga. Okay. And even, sorry for the somewhat pixelated. My sons were really interested in this. They said, "You mean there's manga, Bible manga? We can just go to Bible manga?" Okay. Churches I attended in Japan, yes, they seem to have a whole kind of library of manga and anime to illustrate sort of Bible stories. So, although I guess we have, what, Veggie Tales and things like that. Okay. Anyway. But undoubtedly, the fact that so much of this is image-based and not as much emphasis on actual language has undoubtedly been a major responsibility or major factor as to why manga and anime have gone global. It's fairly easy to export these. So a lot of people, even if they don't understand, what they're looking at entirely, they really need minimal Japanese language or linguistic skills in order at least to get the images. So I think that's been a large part of what's made this genre so popular. I don't know how it is here, but usually every college campus has some very loyal, devoted group of anime people who gather weekly and download all kinds of obscure I'm seeing lots of nods. So that's another reason why this has become very popular. But even in the Swiss villages I lived at, the last time I was there, I was surprised by finding Miyazaki posters in these tiny alpine villages. So it's definitely global. And in fact, within the domestic market of Japan, a Miyazaki film, a new Miyazaki film would easily outsell maybe a Hollywood blockbuster. So it's not quite at that level outside of Japan, but just so you know, at least within the domestic market, what kind of commercial power this is. But there's also artistic influence and impact as well. Okay, so just some international various translations of some anime that you, I'm sure, will recognize. Okay. And then from John Lasseter, creative officer at Pixar. His, Miyazaki's, probably the most famous sort of director, creator of anime right now. His staging, cutting, action scenes are some of the best ever put on film, animated or not. Watching one of his films is the best medicine when you have writer's block. When we at Pixar feel that we're beating our heads against the wall, we go in the screening room and watch one of his films, and it's like, whoa, look what he did. Yeah. I love that quote. Okay, so now I'm going to try to make some connections to some of the pictorial heritage that I think anime also draws from. Now, these are very famous woodblock prints that maybe some of you have already seen. These are so famous, in fact. These are the kind of things that end up on T-shirts and sushi restaurants and whatever. This is a form of printing that became particularly popular in the 18th, maybe through the 19th century. And some of the things that I wanted to look at is the use of color, but also the frame-by-frame nature of a lot of these. Now, these tended to be in series, so that did go along, I think, with the kind of frame-by-frame nature, especially of the manga comic books. There's also a very highly sophisticated kind of graphic design work, this kind of flat design, surface design nature that was really appealing to a lot of people. And you're not the only ones, especially some of the early Impressionists. Some of you may already know that, like Claude Monet. If you go to his residence outside of Paris, he had a huge woodblock print collection, which you can see on display there. Post-Impressionists like Van Gogh also. If you go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, you'll see a very large personal collection that he had. In fact, he thought, Van Gogh, that he was, in moving to the south of France for a period of time, where he did some of his paintings, he was trying to sort of envisage what he thought Japanese culture was. And in some of the letters that we have, when he wrote his brother Theo, he would say things like, I think I've discovered Japan. This is Japan. He meant basically what was in his backyard. So it was his image of what he thought he was seeing. So this kind of aesthetic utopia that was, in a sense, projected onto a culture like Japan. But a lot of it came through these images that were being discovered in Paris and being purchased. For an American example, you have Mary Cassatt as a painter, but then probably the most known one is Frank Lloyd Wright, a residential architect as well. And he had a huge collection. In fact, he financed much of his career at a certain point from selling periodically parts of his woodblock print collection. Okay, another famous slide. Now, both of these feature Mount Fuji. So Fuji is also a sacred site traditionally. So it's a pilgrimage site, and people still make pilgrimages, as well as tourists who go in pilgrim near the peak of Mount Fuji. In fact, Japan, I think I can say, was one of the first countries to invent tourism, modern-day tourism, the way we understand it. And it often went from sacred sites that pilgrims took to later art history students, to later tourists, people going often to the same geographic spots, but for very different reasons in a sense. This kind of woodblock print is near the latter part of the genre, when it focused more on landscape themes. But what I want to say is it's still a sacred site, but it's also becoming secularized, and so you have some of that kind of as well. What I mean by secularized here, I think I'll just mean only this, in that it's not heavily coded, so that it's possible for people to appreciate and enjoy it without having to be heavily versed with history and symbolism. Of course, you're going to catch more the more you know, but it was the easy access that made this very, very exportable to even people who had never traveled to Japan. The other aspect of the woodblock prints are, I guess, what I would consider some of the active composition aspects. So they're often people traveling, okay? And that, I think, also then eventually made its way into the active aspect of making anime films. Another one. Okay. Incidentally, for a lot of the French Impressionists, they were taken up with the study of light, and the play of light was what they were mostly concerned with. So one of the things they were really fascinated by in this other tradition that they discovered was the lack of shadow. So it's probably one of these cases, because Japan becomes known for shadow a few decades later as well. So I don't want to essentialize these aspects, but this aspect of woodblock prints, the lack of shadows, for the most part, made it big as for the French Impressionists. And then by the time you get to, say, the 1920s and the 1930s, a whole other group of artists and writers will look to Japan not for the light and lack of shadows, but for the shadows and mystery and ambiguity and all those things. So, in other words, these things change. Okay. People are kind of drawing different aspects out of the culture, depending on what's going on in their own struggles and in their own artistic forms. Okay, so that's woodblock print. And then what I want to shift to is what's called emaki, or these sort of picture scrolls. I can give you an example here. Okay. These delightful scrolls. This is dating roughly around the 12th century. These are horizontal scrolls. They're also vertical scrolls, but these are horizontal scrolls that tell a narrative or a picture story. Now, in this case, this is often translated as the tale of frolicking animals. It's a Buddhist scroll, so technically religious in topic and in thematic, used to illustrate without having to go through a lot of didactic teaching. So it's a form of, kind of like a parable through illustrated form. But what I think plays into Japanese anime, but also in Japanese film in general, is one, the framing function. Basically, you would unscroll, depending on the length of your arm, and you would just pause, appreciate it, read it, and then roll it up again, and then unfurl another section. So it did have this kind of frame by frame kind of aesthetic, which pretty much underscores what we think of as sort of film. Some people would actually go as far as to say Japan invented cinematography in the 12th century. Here's another example. Now this is technically what I guess I would call a secular example. This is the Tale of Genji scroll, part of the Tale of Genji scroll. The Tale of Genji is a narrative that comes roughly also out of the 12th century. Some people have translated it, early translators looked at it and called it maybe the world's oldest or first novel. That's probably not exactly accurate. Probably you could call it maybe perhaps the oldest narrative that we have. But I know why they use novel. I mean, you've got a protagonist whose name is Genji, and it more or less kind of unfolds and tells a story over many, many chapters. What's interesting here, and I think you can tell, first it's got a Japanese script on it, the phonetic syllabary, but it's also on very beautiful paper. The paper itself is what captivated a lot of people, kind of the gold flecks and the silver and the handmade kind of paper. Some of the strongest paper, acid-free paper we have in the world. So it's actually very productive to do research in Japanese ancient scrolls because it's tough stuff, so it's actually easy to read. Now, the other aspect here, though, is what I also think played into the success globally of anime. When you look at this, I mean, it is telling a narrative, but this script is not that difficult to read, but sometimes it becomes almost incomprehensible. okay? Because the calligraphy can be so playful, okay? So then the question is am I looking at a picture or am I looking at a word, okay? And part of and this is generally true in East Asian calligraphy, is what made it kind of very provocative and interesting for Western philosophers in the 1980s, among sort of deconstructionists especially, is because they were trying to challenge notions of language and try to find another way of looking at language. They were drawn to this kind of calligraphy because to them it was also a painting, as well as also sort of conveying information, if you want to put it that point. Now, I think with modern word processing and computers, it's not exactly the same, but we have a little bit of that, I think, tendency with the way we play with fonts. I mean, there's a little bit of that, I think, that we can see happening. I've got a few more examples from the Genji scroll. Okay. So here you've got a scene from the narrative being displayed, and then you have text on the other side of it, so going back and forth. Okay. And then some sections have no text whatsoever. Okay. Then I'll get to another scroll. This is not the tale of Genji. This is actually a Buddhist scroll from the Lotus Sutra. Now, what's generally true and what distinguishes religious scrolls tends to be because they are more about trying to convey specific teaching, at least in this case, there is more of an urgency to write very, very clearly and very, very distinctly because they're trying to convey doctrine. Okay, so that aspect of it then is very different than, if this is going to work? Yes, okay, than this. Okay, so I'm trying to put kind of the content and form, these kind of things, kind of pit them against each other somewhat here. Okay, and then back to my frolicking animals. Okay, so now this introduces also an interesting tension, and this is a tension in general communication, but it's particularly interesting, I think, in religious discussions. It's the tension of how stable is meaning when you try to communicate it. Is it something that you can totally nail down in language, or once you put it down in the form of a picture or even in the form of a word, are you no longer so in control of the content? Do you see what I'm trying to kind of imagine here? So this kind of form versus content, or vehicle, to use more of a traditional, I think, religious language, versus meaning, or vehicle versus truth. So again, I think anime's popularity is that it does capitalize on these kind of ambiguities. So it was possible globally to grow because the image became autonomous. In fact, I've met many people, I'm not sure the situation here, but many people through watching Japanese anime and through reading manga, because of their desire to understand manga, that seemed to boost Japanese language just because people wanted to study the language in order just to get a better handle of what they were reading. Okay, then I've been throwing around Japanese religion, and I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but just so you know, in case you don't have this background, there are two major traditions in Japan. There are more than two, but these are the two that we normally think of. One is Buddhism, and then one is Shinto. So these are two very different, in some ways, practices. So the upper left is a Buddhist temple, the Todaiji temple. And then the bottom right is something, I think I saw this on your website actually too. It's a very famous kind of floating Shinto shrine. So without getting into too much of the detail here, Buddhism, in many respects, at least the kind that came into Japan, has similarities, I think, and overlap with Christianity. There's a seminary tradition, they have sacred texts, they have monumental architecture. There are these kind of aspects of it. And in fact, even some of their prayers might seem somewhat similar as well. The use of something like a rosary. The Shinto tradition is traditionally considered more of the native practices and is more what is often called animistic or spirit worship. sometimes perhaps seeing animism or spirit worship in nature. So often these monuments of Shinto, gates or shrines, are often in very beautiful spots aesthetically, and not so much what we might think of as more of a rationalistic or rational kind of tradition of teaching and scripture. So another way to put it is it has something kind of more primal about it as well. And in fact, some people have often commented that this aspect of Japan seems somewhat a conundrum, because on one hand, a very advanced society, and yet on the other hand, it seems to hang on to these practices that you might even only find in certain cultures in Africa as well. So it seems to have both that kind of energy, as well as sort of the more cutting edge, sort of technological aspects of it. And I think those two aspects also inform a lot of the preoccupation of anime as well. Okay. I'll move. Now there's another tradition. So I think I'm about getting done with some of the more context aspect of the talk. Japan also has a very highly developed cinema. In fact, this is one area in which you may be aware of Japan's modernization practices that happened roughly about 1860s. There was this catch-up with Europe, with America that happened, where kind of processes that took place in Europe for about 120 years took place in about 40 years in Japan. So it was very intense. Okay? And in fact, the kind of intense modernization that happens in about 1870 on through 1910 or so in Japan, some people would say makes the post-war reconstruction look like child's play. Okay, so it's to that extreme that we're seeing here. So in terms of cinema, that's one area in which Japan did not really catch up with the West. But Japan's cinematic tradition was pretty much in tandem with what was going on in Europe and in America. So these are three photographs of classic Japanese movie makers. So starting with the left hand here is Ozu. He's going to be, I think, someone I'm going to indicate a little later, because he often called himself kind of a Zen movie maker, and what exactly he meant by that, I think we can question. But that's how he characterized himself, anyway. The one at the top right, top center rather, is the most famous of the classic ones, Kurosawa, and probably you've seen or heard of some of his films like Rashomon or Seven Samurai, and they keep remaking Rashomon. What was the one about Facebook? That's basically based on Rashomon, the one that came out not too long ago, a few years ago, I guess. But anyway, they're also making a remake of Rashomon set in Los Angeles right now. And the person on the lower right, Miyazaki, the lesser known of the three. All I'm wanting to do here is to show that there is this cinematic tradition that also is undergirding, as well as sort of the other pictorial one. Now, I think the last thing I'll say about these guys is that whereas I think the cinematic tradition in Europe and in America tended to be indebted a lot to the novelistic tradition and reading, the classical Japanese cinema had a lot of investment in its theater traditions and in its visual arts. So both Kurosawa and Miyazaki say were professionally trained as painters. So they in fact watercolored. Kurosawa did most of his storyboards before he conceived of them in his films. And Ozu characterized himself more as a poet. So there is this kind of aspect, the image-based aspect of film that I think also helps sort of build into what is later developed in anime as well. Last shot. This is from an Ozu film. Just so you get, this is a kind of a typical Ozu frame. Okay, so he in particular also liked this allegiance to frame by frame. And I think what he meant by that he called himself a Zen kind of artist is this emphasis on objects, often objects out of nature, but not exclusively, with very little dialogue. More contemplative, meditative. Okay, now I'm going to transition into anime here. Okay. you might recognize him. He might be making a rebound. I'm not sure these days, but Astro Boy. Okay, now the reason he's up here, a couple of good reasons. The founder, creator of anime is Tezuka. Now he's considered the grandfather of Japanese anime. One of the themes that I think you see, especially in the sci-fi genre of Japanese anime, is this obsession with robotics and this idea of science and technology. So again, that's the cutting edge aspect of it. But the other side is this obsession with innocence and childhood as well. And there's some speculation as to what's driving that. Now, of course, this is this kind of anime. There's a very different other kind as well. But they're, in keeping with the childhood fantasies, there's this idea of overcoming of limitations. So they fly a lot, right? So there's this idea of trying to conquer gravity, conquer one's sort of physical limitations. But there's also the natural aspect of some of anime, especially with Miyazaki's. And this fits into almost kind of a stereotype of Japanese culture, right? So there's one aspect, the technological aspect, that people are kind of obsessed about, the design aspect, if you want to, the kind of thing that Steve Jobs was infatuated with Japanese design. The other aspect is almost a cliche, but Japan as nature, the land of nature, and then you can just fill in the blank, you know, cherry blossom or what have you. And so that kind of Japan also came over in the late 1800s. You know, the cherry blossom trees being donated to D.C., and then after that, many capitals and many centers sort of having their own kind of courtyard or area where they featured cherry blossoms. But then there's this sci-fi aspect that I'm going to look at too. This can be more adult-oriented as well. And the part that the clip I'm going to show you is from Ghost in the Shell, which is really, I think, an interesting exploration of this idea of man versus machine or human identity. So what is humankind? You know, how much is a soul or a spirit? How much is just a machine? You know. And you find, I think, these kind of topics right now. So when I show Ghost in the Shell in my film class, I sometimes couch it in terms of the medical ethics discussions that have been predominant, whether it's in the Terry Schiavo case in Florida, you know, whether you can remove the feeding tube or not. I mean, the argument has to do with where is consciousness at this point. I'll go back to this particular one, but just to show you some of these other shots. A very famous Japanese sci-fi anime, Akira, has a great soundtrack, by the way, too. And in terms of the childhood fantasy with overcoming of limits, Akira really is a good place to start in looking at that. You know, this whole telekinesis theme that goes in, where he starts becoming larger and larger and larger. You know. Okay. Now, undoubtedly, some of this obsession with kind of coupling childhood or children with science and technology, I'm interpreting this as something that happened with Hiroshima and the dropping of the atom bombs as well. So there's some kind of fusion with that kind of scientific outburst and that kind of technology, which was destructive, obviously, with a kind of arrested development, kind of coupling those two things together. This is a pretty complex theme. It gets into very many kind of sub-themes, like moral responsibility or moral guilt, which I can't really get into so much. But I'm just looking right now into this dimension of having, in a sense, been stuck in a certain place in at least literary and film imagination because of having been basically victimized by the atomic bomb. So, and I'm not even taking a position on that at the moment, but in my interpretation, I can say that these two things came together in a way and seems to animate and fuel the Japanese imagination in these, especially the sci-fi genre. I think we're still kind of not sure how Fukushima plays into this with the tsunami and, of course, the radiation coming out from Fukushima. A lot of us were introduced to anime unknowingly. Okay, so this is Speed Racer. Okay. This is a more personal favorite of mine, you know, Gigantor. Okay. Oh, back to Speed Racer. Okay. Kimba the White Lion. Okay, so what's interesting, this is more of a side note, this is more under the impact and influence of anime. Some of you may be aware that when The Lion King opened in Japan, people were shocked because they recognized where that lion came from. Okay. And filed a lawsuit against Disney, in fact, for plagiarism. And it's a pretty good case, actually. Now, Disney, you know, being kind of the 800-pound gorilla, solved the case by simply buying everyone out, I think. But that was some of the influence of anime. Okay, of course. This stuff never dies, right? Like yeah. Okay. Back to my Hiroshima theme. Okay, so this goes along with the apocalyptic aspect of the talk. So I'm trying to introduce my children to Godzilla right now, so this is sort of coming out of that in some ways. But there actually is a very interesting parallel or storyline that you can make with Hiroshima and the way Godzilla was imagined, right? So there's the kind of the nuclear breathing Godzilla, right? The fire out of his mouth. There was kind of the angry, frightening Godzilla, the early Godzilla, which people were scared of, kind of the enemy of Japan. And then the later Godzilla becomes friendlier, becomes almost the defender of Japan. Right? So you can do kind of an interesting allegorical treatment of the film series, depending on the U.S.-Japan Cold War relationship. And then back to another aspect of the future, or the futuristic, is in the question of what is humankind, human identity. Another area is the active development of robotics in Japan. Must be one of the centers internationally for this kind of thing. I was just reading today, actually, because they're developing, you may not know, but Japan has probably the largest percentage of seniors, like 65 and over, in proportion to the rest of the population of the world. So this is a kind of a financial crisis for the country in terms of who pays for the important medical care and caring for, part of the discussion that I think our own country is entering into as well. But this idea of the shrinking tax base, because the country is not reproducing itself in terms of children, much like certain sort of countries in Europe, I think, as well. So that's obviously one sort of major motivation for fueling robotics in terms of actually in hospitals and caring for the lifting of patients. But also for those that aren't bedridden, but being able to actually develop robots that can become companions. Okay. So, and there's actually a growing trend in that as well. So trying to produce the kind of technology that will create robots that can speak, that have softer kind of tactile kind of sensibilities, so that it can pass more for human companionship. And depending on where you are on the spectrum, I mean, there's people that have already bought into this quite a bit, actually. Okay. The other side of this is the porn industry, which you might be able to imagine. Okay. Which has been investing a lot of money in robotics. Okay. But we've been introduced to some of these issues more recently. Oscar Pistorius, now he's famous for other things, but he was, I think, probably the first one to really challenge this issue in terms of man versus machine and in terms of Olympics, whether that ruled him out in terms of being able to participate in the Olympics or not. Okay. But again, just this whole question of, what is the human person? Just a machine, just a body? Then can you have different body parts? Can they also be prosthetics? And then you have some really, I guess, at least from this perspective, out there dreamers, like the director of engineering at Google, Ray Kurzweil. We're going to become increasingly non-biological to the point where the non-biological part dominates, and the biological part is not important anymore. Okay? So in his mind, he actually conceives that the human race will achieve immortality in 2045 is the date that I read. So in his mind, he's thinking computer technology will get to the point of achieving what we call kind of a sentient life, okay, a kind of consciousness. And that basically what we call human awareness can be uploadable in an immortal kind of condition. I'm going to go back to some anime images now. Some of the striking aesthetic aspects of anime, I'm sticking with the theme of nature versus sort of technology and science, but now that I'm talking about nature, it's this incredible kind of pictorial representation you have in anime that they really excel at this, or the landscape. Okay, and there's actually kind of almost a folk tradition of this, at least with Miyazaki earlier on. He had something like a colony, where the artists lived together, they ate together, they drew together. So he was trying to evoke this kind of sense of a folk tradition, almost of a guild. And at least at that stage, a lot of it was hand-drawn, so not necessarily computer-generated art, Okay. And then this, more of a futuristic landscape. This comes from near the end of Ghost in the Shell, which incidentally is not really based in Tokyo, but Hong Kong. Okay. Now I'll get to some of my clips. Let's see if this works here. This is Ghost in the Shell. I'll do, I don't know, just a few minutes of it. There's some text to kind of situate at the beginning.
禁輸措置に抵触する。今回は誘拐の疑いもありそうだな。この男は返してもらう。それは無理だ。彼は亡命を希望し受諾され宣誓書にもサインしとる。いつ答える義務はないな。したがって我が国が国際法に基づき彼を保護し連れ帰る権利を有する。ちなみに宣誓書は大使館にある。後日コピーを転送してやる。いいのか。生きては戻れんぞ。口を慎んでもらいたいな。我が国は平和主義の民主国家だ。窓の外だ。撃て。大学名さん。
I'll pause it right here. I mean, what you're seeing is the creation of a cyborg, basically. And the woman, cyborg that you saw, well, she is a cyborg. And her mission is to try to find and basically neutralize what is called a hacker, which is called the puppet master. So what happens, though, it's like a virus or a bug in the system. The puppet master becomes increasingly difficult to pin down, and it turns out that through the internet and computer sort of world, the puppet master is in more places than just one and seems to be sort of morphing and entering actually into this character as well. So the identities become increasingly difficult to separate. So this is part of what she's doing is throughout the course of this anime, she's wondering her own identity. Who am I? How much am I as human? How much am I as a machine? And then in the end, she and the puppet master almost become indistinguishable. Okay, so then it becomes sort of part of this larger consciousness, which is at this point called kind of the network. So again, I think it's a very suggestive way of talking about sort of where does consciousness begin? Can a program become conscious, become a sentient life? You know, Ray Kurzweil seems to think so, and it's pursued a little bit in this film as well. Some of you probably already saw some easy kind of influence that this film had on the Wachowski brothers and the making of the Matrix. So a lot of that stuff comes from here too. I'm going to kind of give you just focus a few images from Ghost in the Shell. Ghost in the Shell, I think, is really interested in studying this early modernization, early industrialization. So he's got two things going on. One is a study of industry as it happens in the late 19th century. So this is an image of the Crystal Palace, which some of you may not know, but was part of the first World Exposition that happened in London in 1851. Was kind of like what we think of as Disney World, I think. It was an opportunity for nations to showcase their industrial wares, things that they were proud of, things that industry and science have built. But at the same time, it was trying to also show off their folk traditions, things that were kind of culturally distinct, whether it was about Japan or England or what have you. The reason I'm using Crystal Palace is it becomes that kind of early example. I guess you could think of the Eiffel Tower that way too, kind of a feat of engineering, okay, that aspect of science. And Miyazaki, in some of his images in Ghost in the Shell, rather not Miyazaki, but Otomo, he begins to evoke the Crystal Palace. This is near the end of the anime. And there's one other. This is what is considered the safe house for the cyborg that she takes refuge in, that I believe is evoking a Frank Lloyd Wright residence called Falling Water in New York State. Wright is used, I think, in this film as a kind of an interesting hybrid. I mean, modern design, but also a kind of affinity with the natural and with nature. So it's definitely modern, but there's an aspect of it which is linked to nature. And so there's that aspect that tries to fuse with Japanese kind of tradition as well. And Frank Lloyd Wright, I mentioned he was the one that also collected a lot of woodblock prints, but he went back and he designed the first, well, the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo and lived there for some time. So Japan, in his mind, was fusing these two things together as well. Sort of cutting edge design, but also the natural. Then there's one other reference that I can find in Ghost in the Shell. And that's from an Ingmar Bergman film that I'm not sure very many people view anymore, but Persona, which again is kind of this study of schizophrenia and sort of human personalities being split and divided. So there's actually kind of an interesting scene in Ghost in the Shell that I think he's evoking from Persona, actually. And this is the case where then this female cyborg starts trying to think whether she can actually enter into someone else's body and is wondering who she is actually. Is she limited to just her own body, or is she a part of a larger consciousness? They actually go pretty far. So if you've seen the film Blade Runner by Ridley Scott, that was kind of an early sort of study of this kind of thing. What makes man is the emotions. Are emotions things that can be triggered by photographs? And they pursue that kind of theme in Ghost in the Shell as well. If you program enough photographs, then you can re-evoke a kind of a memory of one's childhood and then begin to actually build a sense of warmth, connection to place, all those kinds of associations with family. I'm going to put Ghost in the Shell aside so I can get, because I have one other anime that I want to introduce you to, okay? Ahead here and just talk about Nausicaa, my other example. This is Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind, a very, very famous anime. I see some nods here of Miyazaki. The reason I'm using that is I think this anime in particular exploits and uses traditional religious themes and topics in a way that's pretty powerful. So she becomes almost like a savior, a messianic figure. I'll just give you a brief kind of summary. So this again is in a post-apocalyptic world. So Nausicaa is the leader of one of the remaining sort of tribes of human civilization. The whole planet has been pretty much destroyed by human warfare, and the whole environment has been corrupted, so there's poison floating through the entire world. But the valley that Nausicaa's people comes from has survived because of a kind of a wind that seems to knock out and perform a kind of a protection of the valley. So you can kind of play with it, this idea of the way the wind has been traditionally very powerful, kind of saving force in Japanese history. I won't get into too much of that, but also this sense of the valley and this really rich garden. I mean, that seems to also evoke kind of also Japan in a way. Now, I'm going to make a connection to this fellow. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was the leader, Asahara, of the Supreme Truth cult, which was responsible for the sarin gas attacks in the Tokyo subway system. Which officially that cult was named a terrorist group, I think in Europe and also in the United States. But Asahara liked Nausicaa quite a bit. Okay, so everything from a very trivial kind of superficial sense of his costuming, but also the idea of the use of chemistry, so creating poison. For some of you who don't know, his cult was able to attract the brightest and best from Tokyo University, sort of grad students from the sciences who created his poisons for him. So it's this idea of trying to purge civilization, which he considered to be spoiled, in order to usher in kind of the next stage of things. Basically wiping out evil through accepting evil, using it as a poison. And that's something that you see in Nausicaa, where forgive me if I'm kind of rushing a little bit, but I guess the main point I'm trying to make with Nausicaa is, as opposed to pitting good versus evil, in Nausicaa, she is part of what we traditionally call the evil. So she's not fighting evil like an Indiana Jones figure. she's overcoming herself. So what you'll find in the anime is she's shocked by her own sense of wanting to kill, her own sense of corruption. So part of the purification process she undergoes and wants to save the planet, so to speak, and her own people, is by having to figure out a way how to cure herself. So I'm reading that as a certain kind of religious, if you might call it homeopathy, where you take the poison in order to produce the cure. So it's that kind of sacrificial aspect of certain sort of religious systems that she's trying to evoke. So she actually ends up sacrificing herself. Okay? And that ends up being resurrected as well. So let me just give you some shots of this. These are the god warriors that were responsible basically for much of the destruction some 1,000 years prior. Again, I think evoking a kind of a nuclear power as well. What happens as a result of the kind of the poison and the fallout from 1,000 years ago are that innocent insects become mutant forms and become quite powerful. This is also called Om, and those red kind of circles or spheres are indicating that it's angry, and it kind of goes wild, and there's just thousands of these that rampage. Okay, and part of Nausicaa's power is she quells and pacifies these creatures as well. And this is one case near the end where, the spheres turn blue, and she becomes more of a kind of a passive element in trying to bring them and calm them down from destroying more villages. She's also a chemist, right? So she's got this underwater chem lab in her abode where she's actually experimenting with poison. And you have one case, a very kind of famous shot where she takes off her mask and inhales the poison into herself momentarily. Okay. This is more of her warrior trait. This center figure is basically, quote, a good guy. You call it Yupa. But what he does in a pretty kind of pivotal point in the narrative is he places himself in between Nausicaa and another warrior. And then they're both stabbing him. And so what you begin to see, and there's this focus on blood dripping down the sword, and this begins to terrify Nausicaa. There's actually quite a bit of focus on blood in a prominent way. So again, this notion of sacrifice, I think, becomes a central kind of theme within this. I won't go into this scene. Basically, this clip takes you down into her chem lab and shows you how she tries to purify the poison. And so she has a whole kind of garden down there. They actually use organ music, so it invokes kind of a religious sanctuary downside. Okay. And then in this clip, it shows her at the very end kind of conquering evil by pacifying the Om insects that are rampaging and about to destroy everything. Basically, there's one last fatal war and conflict that's about to begin because, do you remember those god soldiers? They were 1,000 years ago. Someone has managed to make an embryo and preserve one of them and then brings them back into life, and it begins to mutate, and they want to use its nuclear energy as a way of destroying other kind of factions that are at war still. Okay, and so then this is a case where she tries to fly in front of the Om, calm them down. That's the stampede. Okay, what's striking here is this is where the hero, or the protagonist, actually dies. She gets trampled upon by the Om, and her body gets violently flung into the air. But what's interesting here is that the Om heal her with those tentacles. Okay. And then she almost has this resurrection sequence where she floats above everyone. And then she dons the kind of that blue costume and begins to take flight again. Okay. That's the mutant embryo god warrior that's about to destroy the enemy. That's the nuclear beam. I think I'm at the last slide here. The mutant warrior doesn't live long, but he manages to create this kind of what evokes basically, I think, atomic blast. So again, I think what you have happening, and this is my closing, is what scholar Frederick Jameson calls in these sci-fi films a kind of nostalgia for the present. In other words, these films are set way off in the future as a way of looking back on current history often. And in this case, my argument is that these sci-fi anime films seem to have an obsession with nuclear blasts. And in a way, I think they're remembering Hiroshima. It's a way of going backwards and looking back at their historical present. My last thought here is, there's a pretty controversial historian called Hayden White, UC Santa Cruz. He wrote an interesting article called The Modernist Event. And he's looking at Holocaust deniers, people that do historical revisionism and deny that the Holocaust ever occurred, whether it's Auschwitz or what have you. And his claim that he's throwing out there is maybe it's not that these are necessarily such evil or demonic people that are claiming that this thing never happened. But there may be people like that out there, but in his mind, it may be that in modern times, certain catastrophes occurred, like the Holocaust, like Hiroshima, that exceed modern people's ability to even imagine evil and to come to terms with it. So one thing that I want to throw out is that possibly what you're seeing with anime is a struggle, an attempt in a secular society to try to imagine and fantasize evil when they no longer are at total disposal of sort of religious vocabulary or religious language that can allow them to articulate this kind of radical evil, perhaps we want to call it, that they have been confronted with Hiroshima. The Modernist Event by Hayden White, so I'm drawing it and applying it. He doesn't technically apply it to Hiroshima. He keeps it to other examples, but I'm using some of that provocative thesis to interpret, I think, some of what's going on in the sci-fi genre. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm out of time, but hopefully that was it.